The bitter January wind howled mercilessly across the snow-covered plains of Williston, North Dakota, where the endless horizon melted into a steel-gray sky that seemed to stretch forever. Sheriff Marcus Cooper sat motionless in his patrol car, weathered hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee, watching the rhythmic flicker of another oil rig's flame dancing against the gathering darkness. At 52, the past decade's explosive oil boom and subsequent bust had left its indelible mark on both the town and its sheriff lines etched deeper into his once smooth face, silver threading prominently through his dark hair, and a bone-deep weariness in his pale blue eyes that spoke of burdens carried in solitude for far too long. The dashboard clock's red digits clicked over to 11:45 p.m., the only movement in the stillness of his vigil. Third shift was always the quietest, especially during these brutal winter months when temperatures routinely plunged far below zero, turning the very air into something sharp and dangerous. Most folks had the good sense to stay indoors, leaving the streets to the occasional long-haul trucker and the ghosts of Marcus's memories. His gaze drifted, as it so often did during these long night shifts, to the small photograph wedged into the corner of his dashboard, Kate and Emily, his wife and daughter, frozen in eternal summer sunshine at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. The picture was taken just 3 weeks before the accident that had torn his world apart at its foundations. 6 years had passed, but the pain remained as fresh as the day he'd received that devastating call about black ice and a semi-truck that couldn't stop in time. The dispatch radio crackled occasionally with routine check-ins from his deputies, their voices tinny and distant in the vast darkness. Williston had grown exponentially during the oil boom, its population swelling from a quiet farming community of 12,000 to a bustling oil town of over 30,000 in just a few years. The boom had brought prosperity, but also problems: increased crime, overcrowded schools, and a housing crisis that had forced many longtime residents to the margins. Even now, with the boom settling into a more sustainable rhythm, the town still felt like it was trying to find its footing. A movement caught his eye through the swirling snow, pulling him from his reverie. Through the ethereal dance of snowflakes, he spotted a small figure hurrying along Main Street, heading toward the town's only 24-hour laundromat. Marcus frowned, leaning forward in his seat for a better look. It was a child, a young black girl, couldn't be more than 9 or 10 years old, carrying what looked like a stuffed backpack. "What in God's name?" he muttered, checking his watch again. No child should be out alone at this hour, especially not in this weather. He started his engine, the familiar rumble of the Crown Victoria providing little comfort as he slowly followed the girl's path, maintaining a discreet distance. The laundromat's windows cast fluorescent squares of light onto the snow-covered sidewalk, creating an almost otherworldly glow in the darkness. Through the foggy glass, Marcus watched as the girl entered, moving with surprising purpose for someone so young. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, settling into a routine that spoke of long familiarity. Marcus sat in his car, conflicted. Part of him wanted to march right in and demand answers. What parent would let their child out alone at midnight in the dead of winter? But something held him back. Maybe it was the way she carried herself. Or maybe it was the echo of his training about approaching potentially vulnerable individuals. Whatever the reason, he decided to observe for now, to gather more information before taking action. Over the next hour, he watched as she methodically sorted clothes, started a washing machine, and pulled out what appeared to be homework from her backpack. The scene was both heartbreaking and puzzling. This wasn't some teenager helping with family chores. This was something else entirely, something that made his cop instincts tingle with concern. The next night, Marcus adjusted his patrol route to pass by the laundromat again. Sure enough, there she was. Same time, same determined stride through the bitter cold. Night after night, the pattern repeated itself, becoming a sort of melancholy ritual that gnawed at Marcus's conscience and kept him awake during his off hours. He began asking subtle questions around town, careful not to raise any alarms. Nobody seemed to know much about the girl, though a few other night owls had noticed her presence. Mrs. Jensen, who ran the late shift at the Senex station across the street, mentioned seeing her regularly but assumed she must be with family. "Strange hours," she'd said, shaking her head as she refilled Marcus's coffee cup. "But you know how it is with these oil field workers. All kinds of unusual schedules." The mention of oil field workers sparked something in Marcus's mind. He'd seen firsthand how the boom had affected families in the area. Some thrived, but others got crushed under the weight of sky-high rents and the brutal cost of living. He'd lost count of how many families he'd seen fractured by the pressure, splintering apart like ice in the spring thaw. After a week of observation, Marcus decided it was time to make contact. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until the laundromat was empty save for the girl. The temperature outside had dropped to 20 below, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. Inside the laundromat, the fluorescent lights hummed steadily, creating an almost hypnotic atmosphere. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the warm air inside a sharp contrast to the frigid night. The girl looked up quickly, her body tensing at the sight of his uniform. Marcus raised his hands slightly, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Evening," he said softly, keeping his distance. "I'm Sheriff Cooper. Mind if we talk for a minute?" The girl's eyes darted to the door, then back to him, calculating escape routes. She didn't respond, but she didn't run either. Marcus took that as a cautious positive sign. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to her level but maintaining several feet of space between them. He'd learned long ago that physical positioning could make all the difference when trying to build trust. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grace, Grace," Marcus repeated, offering a gentle smile. "That's a beautiful name. Can you tell me why you're here so late? Grace, where are your parents?" The question caused her to shrink further into herself, her small hands clutching the edge of her jacket. Marcus noticed then how worn the jacket looked, how it hung too loose on her thin frame. It was clearly a hand-me-down, probably from a donation bin. "It's okay," he assured her quickly. "You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe." Grace's lower lip trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin with a determination that struck Marcus to his core. He recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen in the mirror for years after losing Kate and Emily. The look of someone forcing themselves to be strong when they were breaking inside. "I'm fine," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm just doing laundry. At midnight? Every night." She didn't answer, but her eyes fell to the floor. Marcus noticed a textbook open on the table beside her, 5th grade math. He guessed from the glimpse of fractions on the page. The book was well-worn but carefully maintained, with neat notes in the margins. "Are you hungry, Grace?" he asked, changing tactics. "The diner down the street makes the best chocolate chip pancakes in North Dakota. What do you say we go get some?" Grace's eyes widened slightly at the mention of food, and Marcus caught the almost imperceptible sound of her stomach growling. But she shook her head. "I can't leave my laundry. We can come right back," Marcus promised. "My treat. Those machines still have at least 30 minutes to go. By my count." The internal struggle played out across her young face, hunger warring with distrust, need battling fear. Finally, hunger won out. She nodded, carefully packing her homework back into her backpack. The diner was nearly empty when they arrived, just a few weary truckers nursing cups of coffee at the counter. Sally, the night waitress who'd known Marcus for 20 years, raised a curious eyebrow at his young companion but held her questions. In their small town, people learned when to probe and when to stay silent. "Anywhere you'd like to sit?" Marcus asked Grace, gesturing to the nearly empty restaurant. She chose a booth near the back, positioning herself so she could see both the door and the kitchen. Marcus noted the strategic choice, another sign that this child had learned to be far too cautious for her age. When Sally approached with menus, Grace seemed to shrink into herself again. but Marcus quickly put her at ease. "Order whatever you want," he said gently. "I mean it. Sky's the limit." Grace's eyes widened as she studied the menu, and Marcus could see her mentally calculating costs. "The pancakes," she began hesitantly. "How much are they?" "Don't worry about that," Marcus insisted. "This is my treat. Remember, get whatever sounds good." After some gentle encouragement, Grace ordered a stack of chocolate chip pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, and hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. When the food arrived, she tried to maintain her composure, but the speed with which she ate told its own story. Marcus watched her, his heart heavy. He'd seen this before, the careful way she cut her pancakes into small pieces, how she occasionally slipped a piece of bacon into her jacket pocket when she thought he wasn't looking. This was a child who didn't know when her next meal would come. Between bites, he got her talking. She was 11, she told him, and attended Roosevelt Elementary School. Her favorite subject was math because numbers always make sense, even when nothing else does. She spoke carefully, giving away little, but Marcus was patient. Years of interviewing witnesses had taught him the value of silence, of letting people fill the empty spaces. "Your parents must be worried about you being out so late," he said finally. Watching her reaction closely, Grace's fork stilled, hovering over her last piece of pancake. "My dad," she began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "He works nights, at the oil fields." It was a lie, and not a very good one. Marcus had known enough kids in trouble to recognize the signs. The way she avoided eye contact, the rehearsed quality of her response, the slight tremor in her voice, all red flags to his trained ear. "Grace," he said gently, "I want to help you, but I can't do that unless you tell me the truth. Why are you really at the laundromat every night?" The facade cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over despite her visible effort to hold them back. "Please," she whispered, "please don't send me away. I'm doing okay on my own. I go to school every day. I do my homework. I keep clean. I don't bother anyone." Her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. On her own. The implications of those 3 words sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter night outside. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "How long have you been on your own?" Grace stared down at her half-eaten pancakes, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her secret was physically crushing her. "Since Mom died," she said finally. 3 months ago. Cancer. Dad left before that. Years ago." The story came out in bits and pieces, like water through a cracking dam. Her mother had been a housekeeper at one of the mid-range hotels that had sprung up during the oil boom. They'd moved to North Dakota 5 years ago from Minnesota, chasing the promise of better wages. For a while, things had been good. They'd had a small apartment, enough food, even a few luxuries. But then her mother got sick. First, she tried to work through it, taking extra shifts to cover the mounting medical bills. But eventually, she couldn't hide it anymore. The cancer was aggressive, and the treatments were expensive. The hospital bills took everything, Grace explained, her young voice heavy with an understanding far beyond her years. "We lost our apartment. Mom made me promise not to tell anyone when she got really sick. She was scared they'd put me in foster care, send me away from the only place that felt like home. So when she died, I just kept going." She'd had some money saved up. Her mother had always insisted on putting something aside for emergencies. Grace had made it last by being careful, by knowing which places would let her stay warm without buying anything, by learning which dumpsters behind which restaurants might have still good food. "The laundromat is warm at night," she explained, "and nobody bothers me there. I can do my homework under the lights, and washing clothes. It makes me feel normal, you know? Like I'm just a regular kid doing chores." Marcus felt tears pricking at his own eyes. He thought of his Emily, who would have been about Grace's age now. The idea of her alone, struggling to survive in the harsh North Dakota winter. was unbearable. "Where do you sleep?" he asked softly. Dreading the answer, Grace hesitated, then mumbled something about finding warm spots. Marcus translated that in his head to mean she was probably sleeping in stairwells, laundromats, maybe the hospital waiting room, anywhere she could find shelter from the killing cold. "Grace," he said, reaching across the table but stopping short of touching her hand. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. Let me help you." She looked up at him, hope and fear warring in her dark eyes. "They'll send me away." "Not necessarily," Marcus said, an idea forming in his mind. What if there was another option? The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, home visits, and bureaucratic hurdles. Marcus threw himself into the process of becoming Grace's foster parent with a determination that surprised even him. His colleagues at the sheriff's department rallied around him, helping to expedite the necessary background checks and home studies. Deputy Sarah Martinez, who'd lost her own mother young, took Grace shopping for clothes and school supplies. Officer Tom Whitehawk, whose grandfather had been one of the first Native American officers in the department, helped Marcus navigate the complex legal requirements for fostering. Even crusty old Judge Peterson, known for his strict adherence to protocol, worked to fast-track the emergency placement papers. The spare bedroom that had remained closed since Emily's death was opened, aired out, and gradually transformed. Marcus let Grace choose the colors. She picked a warm yellow for the walls. "Like sunshine," she said shyly. Mrs. Jensen from the Senex organized a collection among the townspeople, and soon the room was furnished with a proper bed, a desk for homework, and a closet full of new clothes. But the physical transformation of the room was nothing compared to the transformation in Grace herself. First, she was like a wild animal that had found temporary shelter, grateful but wary, always ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She hoarded food in her room, a common behavior among children who had experienced food insecurity. She had nightmares that left her screaming in the night, calling for her mother. Marcus learned to move slowly, to telegraph his movements, to never raise his voice even in frustration. He learned that Grace needed routine and consistency above all else. Regular meals, homework at the same time each day, a bedtime story even though she claimed she was too old for such things. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Grace began to bloom. The change was most noticeable at school, where her teachers reported increasing engagement in class. Ms. Thompson, her math teacher, called one evening to tell Marcus that Grace had offered to help another student with fractions. The first time she'd voluntarily interacted with a classmate. "She's gifted," Ms. Thompson explained, "especially with numbers. But more than that, she's starting to believe in herself again." At home, the changes were subtler but no less profound. Grace began to leave her bedroom door open when she studied. She stopped checking the locks obsessively before bed. One morning, Marcus found her in the kitchen attempting to make pancakes, a disaster of flour and eggshells that ended with both of them laughing and ordering breakfast from the diner instead. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were setbacks, moments when the weight of all she'd lost would come crashing down on Grace with devastating force. Like the day they ran into one of her mother's former co-workers at the grocery store. "Oh my God, Grace!" the woman had exclaimed, rushing over. "We've been so worried. After your mom. Well, no one knew what happened to you." Grace had frozen, the box of cereal she'd been holding falling from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Marcus had stepped in smoothly, steering the conversation away while keeping a steadying hand on Grace's shoulder. But that night, the nightmares had been particularly bad. "I miss her so much," Grace had sobbed, finally allowing Marcus to hold her as she cried. "Sometimes I forget she's gone, just for a second when I first wake up. And then I remember all over again." "I know, sweetheart," Marcus had whispered, his own tears falling into her hair. "I know exactly how that feels." That night had marked a turning point in their relationship. The next morning, over another attempt at pancakes, slightly more successful this time, Grace had asked about the photograph on Marcus's dashboard. "That's Kate and Emily," Marcus said softly, showing her the picture. "My wife and daughter. We lost them 6 years ago. Car accident." Grace had studied the photo intently. "Emily looks happy," she'd said finally. She was. She loved life, loved making people laugh. "A lot like you, actually." Grace had been quiet for a moment, then asked hesitantly, Do you think they'd mind that I'm here?" Marcus had to swallow hard before he could answer. "No, sweetheart. I think they'd be very glad you're here. Kate always said love multiplies. It doesn't divide." As winter gradually gave way to spring, Marcus found himself falling into the rhythms of fatherhood again. He'd forgotten how much he'd missed the simple things. Helping with homework, making lunch for school, listening to stories about playground drama. He'd forgotten how it felt to have someone depend on him, to have a reason to come home beyond just habit. One particularly challenging day came when Grace's school held their annual Parent Career Day. Grace had been quiet all week leading up to it, and Marcus wasn't sure if she wanted him to attend. The morning of the event, she'd emerged from her room wearing her mother's old necklace, a simple silver chain with a small heart pendant. Would you come today?" she'd asked, not quite meeting his eyes. "To talk about being a sheriff?" Marcus had felt his heart swell almost painfully. "I'd be honored," he'd managed to say. The presentation had been a success, with Grace beaming proudly from her seat as Marcus explained his job to her classmates. But the real moment of triumph had come afterward, when he'd overheard her talking to a friend. "That's my dad," she'd said, the words coming naturally, without hesitation. "He keeps our whole town safe." The adoption process moved forward, though not as quickly as either of them would have liked. There were evaluations to complete, reports to file, court dates to attend. But through it all, their bond continued to strengthen. They developed their own rituals and traditions. Sunday mornings were for pancake experiments. They were gradually getting better, though still nowhere near as good as the diners. Wednesday nights became board game nights, with Grace displaying a ruthless streak at Monopoly that both impressed and slightly terrified Marcus. And every Saturday evening, they would visit the laundromat together. Not because they needed to. Marcus's house had a perfectly good washer and dryer, but because it had become their special place, a reminder of where their journey together had begun. "You know," Grace said one such evening, as they sat on the familiar bench watching the machine spin. "I used to be so scared here, not of anything specific, just scared of everything, of being alone, of being found out, of what would happen to me." Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "And now it's different. Now it's like a story we can tell, about how something good can come from something bad." Marcus thought about that a lot over the next few weeks, as they prepared for their final adoption hearing. Grace was right. Their story was about transformation, about how the darkest moments could sometimes lead to the brightest futures. The day of the adoption hearing dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect North Dakota spring days when the sky seems endless and anything feels possible. The courthouse in Williston was packed with well-wishers, fellow officers, teachers from Grace's school, neighbors who had watched their unlikely family come together. Mrs. Jensen from the Senex was there, beaming proudly from her seat. Sally from the diner had closed up shop for the morning to attend, bringing a box of her famous chocolate chip pancakes. Even some of the truckers who'd been regular customers during Grace's late-night laundromat days had shown up, their massive frames squeezed uncomfortably into the courthouse benches. When the judge officially declared them father and daughter, the courtroom erupted in applause. Marcus swept Grace up in a bear hug, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "Grace Cooper," he whispered, testing out her new name. "My daughter, Dad," she whispered back, the word now natural and sure on her tongue. As they left the courthouse, Grace tugged on Marcus's hand. "Can we go somewhere special?" she asked. "Anywhere you want, sweetheart. It's your day. Can we go to the laundromat? Marcus raised an eyebrow in surprise. The laundromat? Are you sure? Grace nodded solemnly. It's where our story started, she explained. I want to remember it, but differently now, as the beginning of something good. Hand in hand, they walked to the laundromat. It looked different in the spring sunshine. The harsh fluorescent lights softened by the natural daylight streaming through the windows. They sat together on the bench where Marcus had first approached Grace, remembering how far they'd come. You know, Marcus said softly, I used to think this place would always remind me of sad times, of finding you here alone, scared and trying so hard to be brave. Grace leaned against him, nodding. It was scary before, she admitted, but now it's special, because it's where I found you, where we found each other. After that, they made one more important stop. The cemetery was peaceful in the spring afternoon, the rows of headstones casting long shadows across the freshly mowed grass. Grace held Marcus's hand tightly as they approached Kate and Emily's graves. Marcus had been here many times over the years, but this visit felt different. For the first time, he wasn't coming with just his grief for company. Grace stood beside him, clutching the bouquet of wildflowers they'd picked on the way. Hi, she said softly to the graves. I'm Grace. I'm your new daughter and sister. I promise I'll take good care of Dad. We'll take care of each other. Marcus felt tears rolling down his cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of pure sorrow. Standing there with Grace's hand in his, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. His past and his present had finally reconciled, allowing him to look toward the future with hope. That future was already taking shape. Grace was thriving in school, her natural gift for mathematics blossoming under encouragement and stability. She joined the school's math club and was talking about wanting to be an engineer someday. I want to build things, she'd explained, things that last. Marcus found himself changing too. The weight of grief that had been his constant companion for so long began to lift. He started accepting dinner invitations from colleagues, joined the school's parent committee, even signed up to coach Grace's soccer team despite knowing nothing about the sport.